We've got 4 places across 4 different decades. Washington, D.C., 1987. Nebraska, 1988. Belgium, 1996. And New York, 2005. 4 cases, 4 scandals. Each begins with horrifying allegations of children being exploited and ends with the same result. Investigations derailed, witnesses silenced, files sealed, evidence hidden, and powerful names quietly erased. Franklin, the Finders, Jeffrey Epstein, Marc Dutroux. We did a video on 2 of the 4. All of them serve as warnings about what might very well be an insidious and pervasive cancer in our society. When we examine the details, a pattern emerges. Too many similarities to reasonably chalk it up to coincidence. The crimes crossed borders and governments, also time. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Tonight we're asking the questions. Is this just a bunch of tragic coincidences? Or is this a rabbit hole? If so, how deep are we talking here? Like so deep we're pretty much guaranteed not to like where we end up, or so deep we're never going to reach the bottom? Both terrible options. Omaha, Nebraska, summer of 1988. Imagine a tight-knit community that trusts its bank implicitly. That bank is Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. The manager is Lawrence E. King Jr., Larry for short. Larry was a charming, well-connected figure with lots of swag. Neighbors called him Roy Rogers because he lived like a rich celebrity. He was flashy. The source of his extravagant wealth was questionable, far above his salary as bank manager. Still, he was a popular guy in the community, well-connected in local politics, and basically lived a rock star lifestyle. But Larry was about to have a bad day. Federal auditors uncovered a $40 million shortfall. Franklin's big, beautiful bank was insolvent. This is a bank that once embodied Midwestern values, now just a shattered facade. Larry became the symbol of its collapse. In the aftermath of the bank's implosion, whispers started up. Some of the foster kids in the Franklin system disappeared from public view. When they later resurfaced, their stories revealed a darker truth. This wasn't just about financial crime. This rabbit hole went deeper. Trafficking of minors. Paul Bonacci was first exploited at around 13 or 14 years old. Testified that he was later paid to lure children into Larry's circles. Paul said he was flown to extravagant parties in other states. Children would be lured to Omaha and trapped. Alicia Owen, a former foster child, testified that in August 1983, when she was 14, she attended a party in a luxury penthouse. She described drug use, inappropriate games, professional photographers, intimate moments with adults. Bad stuff. Horrifying. Goes without saying their testimonies were pretty shocking in the context of a banking fraud case. Alicia described being taken to Boys Town Orphanage by authorities, only to be passed to outsiders along the way. These were all legitimate foster children who were supposed to be protected. Clearly, they were not. By mid-1989, Nebraska lawmakers get their act together enough to form a bipartisan investigative committee. Now, private investigator Gary Caradori is hired to get to the bottom of it all. Things like tracking down documents and re-interviewing victims for a start. He'd also follow leads beyond documents in a courthouse. And speaking of courthouses, he was there for the hearings. The hearings were electric. Bonacci, tearful but surprisingly meticulous, described how these foster system routes intersected with high society contacts. He was pretty clear in his testimony. He quite literally named individuals. He named names. Well, you can imagine that the courtroom got pretty quiet, and ultimately legislators were compelled to listen, if not act. In July 1990, investigator Gary and his 8-year-old son boarded a plane to Chicago to retrieve a treasure trove of photographic evidence. His bombshell evidence. A smoking gun, if you will. Well, tragically, Gary's plane broke up midair. He and his 8-year-old son perished. His briefcase purportedly contained evidence, interviews, photographs, visual proof that would break this case wide open. Now, incinerated in the wreckage. Gone. They got the remains of some of the other parts of the plane, but the briefcase? It's somehow incinerated utterly and completely, leaving no trace whatsoever. Well, this is certainly curious. I'm talking about the timeline. Let me lay it out. Gary and his son flew out of Chicago at around 2 a.m. The wreckage was found just after dawn in a Lee County field. Pilot fatigue and probable spatial disorientation or possible instrument malfunction were noted unloaded by investigators. What does that mean? I see a few options. Maybe he was tired, or maybe he was drugged, or maybe his plane had a sudden and suspiciously convenient mechanical failure. Still, investigators say no evidence of foul play. Lee County Sheriff Tim Bivens told local press that no evidence of sabotage was found in the wreckage, and that the NTSB, that's the National Transportation and Safety Bureau, was tasked with determining cause. FBI Rockford was notified but not participating. The county guarded the morgue and the crash site during the initial phase. No evidence of foul play. But Nebraska State Senator Loran Schmidt, who actually chaired the legislative probe that hired Gary in the first place, publicly expressed suspicion about the crash soon after it happened. This was covered in Nebraska papers. Senator Schmidt suspected murder. He wasn't alone. His suspicion was shared with the general public. It didn't and still doesn't pass the smell test. Still, investigators say no evidence of foul play. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Nebraska press summaries and later accounts say that Senator Schmidt reported that Gary called him from Chicago shortly before the flight, saying that he got his hands on crucial photographic evidence and that, quote, they got him by the short hairs now. This information was widely repeated in press clippings and articles, though not corroborated by official records. Still, investigators say no evidence of foul play. Books and alternative press accounts, such as John DeCamp's book, The Franklin Cover-Up, suggest a briefcase with photos and interviews was missing from the debris and never recovered. I note that this appears in secondary sources, not in the official federal investigatory files. And again, remember, investigators say no evidence of foul play. One last thing worth mentioning about this tragic accident: some publications and later compilations reference a farmer claiming he saw a flash and explosion before impact. Again, this language does not appear in the official federal investigation report, and it certainly isn't included in their ultimate determination of probable cause. The information is secondary and circulated through non-official outlets. The legacy news media somehow missed it or disregarded it as not newsworthy or something else. The key takeaway here is that ultimately the feds ruled it a tragic accident. But to many, the suitcase, which somehow incinerated totally and completely, symbolized the truth. Was it destroyed in the flight, never to be examined? Was it taken from the scene? Did it even exist in the first place? As the narrative unraveled, the grand jury came back with words that screamed carefully crafted hoax. The system seems to have come to a complete halt and even managed to shift into reverse. The victims were now caught in the crosshairs. Alicia Owen was indicted for perjury. Paul Bonacci was publicly discredited. The media shifted its tone from shock to speculative skepticism. Owen was indicted on 8 counts of perjury based on discrepancies and inconsistencies in her testimony. Her trial lasted 5 weeks with over 4,000 pages of trial testimony and 182 exhibits. She was convicted and sentenced to 9 to 15 years in prison. This is harsh for a perjury case. It demonstrates how seriously the court viewed the perceived damage of her statements. Curiously, despite facing huge legal consequences, Owen refused to recant her allegations. Bonacci, another former foster child, also testified about being trafficked and abused. Although he wasn't immediately convicted of perjury like Owen, there were reports that he was indicted, though this was later dropped. His credibility was significantly undermined by the grand jury's conclusion that the trafficking ring was all a hoax. The grand jury's label of a hoax and statements from other witnesses who recanted, such as Troy Bonner and Danny King, cast doubt on Bonacci's testimony. The other witnesses who recanted said Owen made it all up with promises that they would somehow get rich by making these purportedly false allegations. Meanwhile, Larry pleaded guilty on bank fraud charges. He was sentenced to 15 years. Nothing on trafficking, nothing on children. So the official record says he's a criminal who scammed a bank, not a predator who may have trafficked in minors. In the late 1990s, Bonacci filed a civil suit and won a default judgment because Larry never showed up to appear. He was ordered to pay millions, but no delivery followed, of course. But legally, the judgment stood, so Bonacci's claim had at least some merit, enough to warrant a default civil award. Conspiracy author John DeCamp put together a book, The Franklin Cover-Up. He cites sealed documents and trauma-laced court records. Researchers keep probing abuses, burial of files, sidelined ministers, legacy media silence. It became Omaha's darkest secret. continues to swell in the shadows. Here's a common theme, not just for Franklin's horror story, but for every case we'll look at. It always seems to involve powerful figures. Children who were supposed to be protected become targets. And then there's the system, legislators, law enforcement, media. A pattern emerges. Leaks sealed, victims silenced, files buried. Gary's plane crash wasn't just tragic, it was a blow to the inquiry. And it makes me wonder, is this a tragic but isolated incident? Does the same methodology, namely silence and obfuscation of truth, exist in other countries and other eras? If we look deep enough and really examine the details, is there a pattern? If so, maybe these aren't isolated rings after all. Maybe they're signs of a pervasive, global, and systemic cancer, an organized network benefiting from these unconscionable acts in some fashion. That brings us to Belgium, August 1996. Police raid the home of Marc Dutroux, a 39-year-old convicted child toucher who was previously imprisoned in the late 1980s, but was paroled after serving just 3 years of a 13-year sentence. Inside his house, investigators find something unimaginable. 2 teenage girls. 12-year-old Sabine was abducted the morning of May 28, 1996, while riding her bike to school. She was held behind a false wall in Dutroux's cellar and repeatedly essayed over an 80-day period. 14-year-old Letitia was seized on August 9, 1996, after leaving a swimming pool. She was kept in the same concealed cell as Sabine for 6 days before they were both rescued. The 2 girls were alive, but as the search expanded, the story gets worse, much worse. Within days, authorities uncover the bodies of 2 8-year-olds, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau. They were buried in Dutroux's garden. The girls disappeared together on June 24, 1995, and were similarly imprisoned in Dutroux's makeshift dungeon cellar. Tragically, the 8-year-old girls died of starvation after Dutroux was jailed for car theft for a brief period. His wife, Michelle Martin, admitted she failed to feed them in her husband's absence. Later, 2 more girls, 17-year-old Anne Marchel and 19-year-old Effie Lambrex, were discovered in another property linked to Dutroux. They were kidnapped together on August 22, 1995, held at Dutroux's properties, drugged and restrained. The girls were buried alive after being drugged and wrapped in plastic. Shockingly, Dutroux had already been on police radar for years. Without beating around the bush, he was a known offender. Neighbors occasionally reported screams. One time, a locksmith told authorities about Dutroux's suspicious cellar outfitted with chains. Curiously, no action was taken, nothing was done. Even more curious, later investigations revealed what at best amounts to staggering incompetence. Tips were ignored, surveillance files misplaced. A number of judges recused themselves from the case. Curious. Coincidence? In a particularly controversial moment, Judge Jean-Marc Conneret, the only magistrate seen as sympathetic to the victims, was removed from the case in 1996 after attending a fundraising dinner for the families. His removal sparked outrage across Belgium. Still, nothing was done. Around this time, public trust was at an all-time low. October 1996 saw the largest demonstration in Belgian history. Around 300,000 Belgians took to the streets in what became known as the White March. Ordinary citizens dressed in white marched in silence through Brussels. They demanded justice, accountability, perhaps some kind of action. Above all, they wanted answers. Though you might say the demonstration wasn't just about Dutroux. It was about the catastrophic collapse of public trust in a government that failed them utterly and completely. Or worse, incompetence is one thing, but maybe it wasn't failure. Maybe they deliberately looked the other way. Here's where the Dutroux case shares some similarities with the Franklin case. During interrogation, Dutroux claimed that he was part of a larger network supplying children to elites. He named businessmen. He hinted at judges and politicians. One associate, Michel Niol, a Brussels businessman with political connections, was arrested. At trial, however, prosecutors portrayed Michel as peripheral. The government rejected the idea of a vast network. Officially, it was dismissed as a fantasy. The circumstances seem pretty notable to me. Witnesses died in suspicious ways. Files went missing. Conneret, the judge, was removed. Police errors left and right. The government's general unwillingness to see the bigger picture here, such as it may be. I gotta say, to the public, this was starting to look a lot less like incompetence and more like a cover-up. In 2004, 8 years after his arrest, and after a multitude of delays, Marc Dutroux was convicted of unaliving, essaying, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison. His wife, Michelle Martin, who helped him, was sentenced to 30 years, but she was paroled in 2012. Go figure. Officially, Belgium closed the book. This was a tragic and horrific case, but as horrible as it was an isolated incident. Just a predator and his accomplices. No grand conspiracy. Show's over, nothing more to see. Like Franklin, the Dutroux case showed a clear pattern. Young victims, allegations pointing upward towards a higher authority, investigations derailed or declared a hoax, survivors silenced, investigators removed, and in the end, the truth sealed away and the victims and the general public left holding a bag of unanswered questions. These are repeating patterns. When patterns like this repeat across countries and decades, it's kind of difficult to dismiss them as coincidence. The question isn't whether Dutroux acted alone. The question is why, whenever these cases come to light, do the institutions tasked with protecting the vulnerable seem to protect themselves instead? Food for thought. Washington, D.C. and Tallahassee, 1987. The Finders. We did a video on this case. Click the link to see the video and get a deeper dive. But for now, I'll briefly mention it to further demonstrate the overall bigger picture. The pattern. Police find 2 men with 6 unkempt children in a Florida park. The children are dirty, hungry, and say that they've been living on a farm and traveling a lot. They rarely, if ever, have seen a doctor, and the men are linked to a secretive DC group or called the Finders. DC police raid a warehouse used by the group. They remove bags of photographs and slides. Some of the evidence includes slides of children, plus travel logs, telexes, and notes suggesting international contacts. The Washington Post called the case no simple matter. They reported that authorities alternately described the Finders as a commune or a cult accused of child neglect and bizarre practices. Then the story takes a turn down a rabbit hole. Federal memos later released show agents were told that parts of the case were a CIA internal matter. Got that? Not surprisingly, the criminal investigation faded away with no trafficking charges brought. The Associated Press's retrospective put it plainly. Ties were alleged, no prosecution followed. The FBI's own FOIA archive holds hundreds of pages on the Finders. Still, no grand conclusion. In 2005, Palm Beach police arrested Jeffrey Epstein for allegedly paying underage girls for Fast forward to 2008. Instead of facing full prosecution, Epstein secured a secretive federal non-prosecution agreement with U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. His sweetheart deal granted him immunity from federal charges and offered payoffs to dozens of victims who were instructed not to speak publicly. Shockingly, Epstein's sweetheart deal agreement remained largely unknown until 2018, when investigative reporters at the Miami Herald brought it to light. Their investigative reporting revealed how the justice system effectively protected Epstein. In July 2019, Epstein was arrested again on new charges of trafficking minors in New York. Agents seized hundreds of nude photos. The public was and remains outraged. On August 10th, Epstein was found deceased in his cell. It was officially ruled a suicide by hanging, but the conclusion raised eyebrows immediately. It still does, which is why we're talking about it right now. Dr. Michael Baden, a respected forensic pathologist, was retained by Epstein's brother, and he said that a pattern of neck injuries, especially the fractured hyoid bone, was much more consistent with strangulation than suicide. Now that's all well and good, but New York's chief medical examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, disagreed. She said she's confident the cause is suicide and dismissed any assertion to the contrary as uncompelling. Now I'm like the next guy. I'm willing to believe what the authorities are telling me to a point, but when the science doesn't add up, my eyebrows raise. It's pretty much a given that science tells a different story from New York City's chief medical examiner, my opinion. The hyoid bone, it's a small U-shaped bone located in the upper neck above the larynx. It sits below the mandible. It's the only bone in the body that doesn't directly connect to another bone. It's suspended by ligaments and muscles. Now that's kind of important. Got that? Roughly 1/3 of strangulation victims show a fractured hyoid. By contrast, it's a rare occurrence in suicidal hangings, especially in younger or middle-aged adults. In suicidal hangings, especially partial suspensions, hyoid fractures are even less common. under 5%. There's an exception for elderly victims whose bones are brittle, but clearly Epstein didn't fit into that category. This is why forensic pathologists treat fractured hyoids as red flags. Its presence alone doesn't prove homicide. It doesn't prove anything really, but it strongly suggests direct compressive force around the neck, the kind most consistent with throttling or strangulation. Dr. Baden publicly opined that Epstein's injuries, including his fractured hyoid bone and the neck fractures, were more consistent with homicide than suicide. New York City's chief medical examiner said nope. After that, New York doubled down. The Bureau of Prisons released what it claimed was a video recording of Epstein's cell intended to prove he was alone. Curiously, an independent review by press and analysts revealed it was only audio of his cell block. The video recording was not of his cell. Whoops. Also, there was a minute time gap in the recording, precisely when Epstein was found unresponsive. Oh, and the audio's questionable integrity, that made the picture look even worse. Epstein's case didn't end with an arrest, and I'm not convinced it ended at all. We started this with a few questions. Is this an isolated and admittedly shady-looking coincidence, or are we dealing with a rabbit hole? Is there a pattern? Are the patterns necessarily related? Is there an overarching conspiracy at work here? I think this is but the tip of an iceberg, something that will rock the very foundation of our society. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, or shoot us an email. I'm John Genoa. You're watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.